Nice to meet everybody. Kath Rogers. I'm a staff attorney over at the ACLU of Southern California, where Steve is on our board. And I work on what's called the Economic Justice Project at the ACLU, where we work to advance economic rights. And specifically, I'm on our Dignity for All project, which works. We have two North Star principles. One is we fight against the criminalization of poverty, and the second one is we fight for a right to housing. And like Steve said, I worked previously with the National Lawyers Guild, and I can get into that later, but nice to be here with everyone. My pronouns are she and her.
Thank you, and welcome to the Friday Forum. I see, so we have at this moment 13 participants. I think everyone has introduced him or herself or themselves. And I believe the next item is for me to ask for any affiliate or any, I believe it's any affiliate announcements. Is that correct? Does anyone want to tell us about any events or status reports for any affiliate organization? Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so it's time to call upon our this day's reflector, and I'm not sure who that is.
Me.
So, Rose, or
yes, yeah,
it's you, Rose. Okay, that's wonderful. I'm delighted to say Rose Leibowitz will give us a reflection today. Thank you.
okay. Well, my pre-reflection is an apology. I mean, with all that's been going on with the big hearings in Washington and the terrible shootings, I feel my reflection should be about one of them, but it's not. And it's pretty self-indulgent, to be quite honest, but I thought it might be a matter of interest to people. So here I go. When I was called for jury service, I imagined the 5th or 6th time that I've spent a long day sitting in a room downtown and gone home at the end of the day feeling quite virtuous that I had fulfilled my civic duty. I could have opted out without a doctor's note because I'm over 70, but since there's nothing wrong with me, I don't feel comfortable creating an ailment. Anyway, I like being downtown and walking through a grand park and seeing all the big buildings and the cathedral. It's like a day off. So when about 50 of us were called and sent to the 7th floor, I was still pretty calm. Once up there, we were given new numbers, and when mine was 12, a certain fear took hold that I might actually end up on a jury. The fear increased when I heard the questioning and realized the judge was closely questioning anybody with a family member who is a lawyer, and I do not have that red flag. The first drama took place when the juror sitting behind me keeled over with a heart attack. We soon discovered there are no first aid personnel at the court, and we had to wait out in the hallway for a good 20 minutes before the paramedics from LAFD came and trundled him away. I hope he's okay, but it was not an auspicious start. Back inside, it was a long day of questioning the prospective jurors. What I took away from that was that only a small percentage owned up to having significant others or children. That is partly because some of the jurors were fairly young, but I was still surprised. It seemed like an isolation somehow. Delay over the sick gentleman meant that we had to reappear the next day to continue questioning. By the end of day 2, we were chosen and opening statements had been presented. So my next concern as a juror who has to return 2 days is what to wear. The jury summons stresses professional casual clothes, and guess what? I threw them all away when I retired. I now vary between very grungy clothes for hiking and being at home, and a few rather nice things for the occasions when I go out. Looking around, I felt my age. The younger jurors' concepts of smart casual included torn, dirty jeans, shorts, spaghetti straps, and other such clothes that I would not be wearing at this time. Actually, the people whose clothes threw me the most were the translators. Their clothes and even personal cleanliness seemed to leave a lot to be desired. My next issue was getting there on time. I'm a great fan of public transportation, and that decision was easy. But it seems the bus lines and the subway line make no effort to coordinate. So I would run off the bus to get to the red line and find I'd missed the train by 1 minute and had 19 minutes to wait. Once the bus and train came, everything was fine, but the journey took a long time because of the waits. Having said that, it was an interesting exercise in people watching, and I'm glad to say that both bus and train were being well used by a good section of the population. There were some people sleeping on the train and subway stations, but not the overwhelming dormitory that there was during the pandemic. I hope those people have now got some shelter. Both our DA and the public defender were young. And I don't know how typical it is, but the judge called an awful lot of sidebars. I would just get comfortable in my seat and begin to concentrate. We all had to go outside into the hallway and back again in 10 to 20 minutes. Later, that got very tedious very quickly. Then there was the very long lunch break, 12 to 1:30. By 1:30, I had read the paper, done the crossword, and was going stir crazy. Luckily, some men who work in an adjacent building have a soccer game in the park every day, and it was fun to sit out there and watch it. And they bonded with me because I come from a soccer country. I sat rather close the first day and nearly got hit by the ball, but anyway. Finally, we were sat in a room and allowed to deliberate. This was also interesting. We were 6 men, 6 women, 1 Black woman, 1 Asian man, 5 white people, and 5 Hispanic jurors. The discussion was led and dominated by 2 white men, 2 white women, and the Black woman. 3 of the Hispanic jurors had to be coaxed to speak. Language was not the problem, it was confidence. An interesting comment on the state of strangers meeting in Los Angeles. Well, it's over, and hopefully it's the last time I have to do this. Thank you.
That was delightful, Rose, and very stimulating. We could almost have a Friday forum based on what you just said. That it was really wonderful. And I'm tempted to open the forum to other people's responses, but I want to make absolutely sure that we give Kath the full time that she needs to make her presentation and to hear questions. But what I find what you said is so interesting that I don't know, is there, do people have a sense that maybe we could have 5 minutes of conversation and reaction to that? Steve Rohde?
Yes, the agenda provides 5 minutes of commentary, and it's 7:54. I raise my hands because I hope nothing Rose says will diminish the willingness of everyone on this screen to serve on a jury. It is vital that intelligent, compassionate, caring people, as we have today, serve on juries. I've served on a couple. It can be a very strange experience and a mixed bag, but I was glad I served. I wrote an article on serving on a jury, and I think it is part of our civic responsibility. So I hope everyone will not seek every excuse to avoid serving.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to create that impression. It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, you know? So anyway, I absolutely agree. Yes.
Great.
My hand is up next, and I definitely want to hear from Anthony. So in my experience, if I tell the truth to either the defense attorney or the prosecutor, I will be disqualified. If I tell the truth, if I talk about how I feel about police testimony or the so-called criminal justice system or the nature of prosecutorial activity, I will be disqualified, and I don't want to call on him this second, but I would like to hear from Steve Rohde about that. So Anthony.
Well, I've never served on a jury, and I felt a lot of what Rose was saying. I hoped at one point I never would have to do it because it's such a hassle. But what churned my mind was I have a friend who is a Quaker at Whittier Friends Church. She served on a jury duty, and a Black man was being accused by a police officer of some crime. And when the jury went to deliberate, it was like the whole jury would say, well, it's open, let's shut. Police officer testified it was him. Case closed. And then my friend said, well, wait a minute. Let's look at the transcript of what the police officer said. And as they examined the testimony, it was clear there were huge discrepancies. The police said the man was over 6 feet tall. The man was actually 5'8". There was all kinds of things like that. And finally, the jury was moved to acquit because the police testimony was so problematic. So I after that, I was clear if I ever got a chance to serve on a jury, I would.
Let me clarify that I wanted to be on the jury. There, the defendant was a young man, and I was really fearful for his future, and very, as always, very skeptical about the prosecution, and even deeply skeptical about the legitimacy of the law under which he was being charged. I wanted to be on that jury to make a case of that nature, but in answering questions from the prosecuting attorney, I ended up being passed over as a choice. Now, the next hand that I see is Rick Banales. Rick?
Rose, thank you very much for talking about your experience. I had, Dave, a similar situation as you had, where I was supposed to serve on a jury, and this was about a gun that a defendant was carrying, and I started asking questions during the jury selection about, well, this was at Rampart. Wasn't there an issue a few years ago with Rafael Perez and a few other officers?
Rick, hang on one second. We have a very strong echo happening on your on your microphone.
Well, that's because I'm speaking the truth. And if someone can go on mute, that'd be great. Okay, so I talked about this, and I have seen very few glares from a human being as I saw from the prosecutors, the district attorney's office, from their table. And I got glared at the whole way through, and obviously I didn't get on the jury. So yeah, I think basically it's our responsibility to serve if we can, just for the responsibility that we have to make sure that there is a check and balance in the justice system as well.
Thank you, Rick. I strongly agree. The next hand I see is Carol Francis, and then I see Rose's hand. So Carol Francis?
Yeah, I echo what Dave said. There's no way. I'm listening to these questions like, have you ever been a witness? Or have you ever been, I can't remember whether it is, and I thought, yeah, when I was a defendant for sitting down in front of the federal building, whatever. However, when I realized that, what I did is I answered every question as strongly as possible, knowing that I wasn't going to get on, so I could at least educate the people who did get on. For instance, when they asked, do you believe that, would you believe the testimony of somebody because he was a gang member? Would that affect your? And I'm saying, well, yeah, and I'd also, know that the police lie all the time and they fabricate evidence, and there's documented examples of that. So, if I can't get on, I'm going to say everything I can to get people who are on to see it differently.
I think that's a great point, Carol Francis. Rose, your hand is raised next.
Yeah, I just put my hand up again just because I wanted to clarify. I mean, as I said, it was a tongue-in-cheek thing, really. But just to kind of, just to give you a little bit, it was a domestic violence case, which immediately raises a red flag particularly among women. But when we actually got into the jury room, the people who dominated the discussion were actually the most liberal, shall we say? And the people who had taken it on surface value were the people who took longer to speak. So it was actually a very interesting dynamic. I mean, I just wanted to say that. And he was actually acquitted unanimously, and it didn't take us that long, maybe an hour and a bit. So it's not the end of the world. And I do say it is an important thing to do. I mean, it really is.
And I strongly agree with you. And I'd like to hear from Jasmine. I think we're over our 5 minutes, but Jasmine, please give us your response to Rose's reflection. And would you unmute if you can? There we go.
Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry I'm late. Sorry I'm late this morning. Peace, Mom. Westchester Christian Science Church. I agree with. I'm sorry I missed her reflection, but I did do my jury service, and I was not selected. I just sat in there in the waiting room the whole time, and I learned a lot about how they choose, how they pick and choose, and they pick and choose who they want, and who's going to be who's going to meet their needs at the time. And yes, I did it because I knew it was my civic duty, and I felt responsible and compelled as a citizen to do it. And it made me feel good. It made me feel like I was doing my civic duty. And I feel like if you have the opportunity to do it, because it is once in a lifetime thing. And yes, it's for everybody, and everybody should have the opportunity to do it, I think. Yes, I do think that it should be taught like very early, not elementary, but like middle school, because the more we educate, the better we are. I feel that's what I feel, and I do agree. Like it's a civics lesson, and we have to do more education, more talking with our neighbors, more engaging with our communities, because the more we engage, the more we know, and the better we know, and even in bilingual, like going into other languages, it helps to be able to communicate with others. So I'm sorry I have another event this morning. I'm gonna stay on, but I just so much going on, and I really appreciate everyone's presence this morning, and thank you so much for letting me share. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. And Steve Rohde, we're over time on these responses, but do you have anything to add, given what you have heard since you spoke yourself?
No, I appreciated this whole range of comments, so I'm eager to move our program along. And
I believe you are the man who will perform the introduction. Is that correct?
I'd be happy to do that. I've previewed a lot of this at the National Lawyers Guild and my contacts with them through Jim Lafferty and his radio show on KPFK and other interactions. I was so impressed by Kath and delighted then to see her turn up at the ACLU and in these roles of economic justice. It's been a long time coming within the ACLU to see economic justice as a civil liberty. The Southern California affiliate played a leading role nationally to convince the ACLU that if you cannot have a safe home, if you cannot have a job, if you cannot have work, if you cannot have economic freedom, you cannot fully exercise all of your civil liberties and civil rights, and that in a sense, economic justice is at the cornerstone of the freedoms and liberties we take for granted. So to have someone so talented and compassionate as Kath in these positions is a great credit to the ACLU. Kath and I have worked on the Economic Justice Committee of the ACLU. It was, in fact, in a presentation about 6 weeks ago that I realized how much ICUJ benefit from a full program presented by Kath. And I do hope, Kath, you'll weave into your remarks, as Dave indicated, just some indication of your interests, what brought you as a talented lawyer. You had lots of options of where you wanted to devote your career, and we're always interested in the personal path that people take. We're eager for your presentation, and then we love questions and answers, because as you may have already found, this is a very inquisitive and curious group of people. So thank you, Kath, for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. I'm really excited to be here with everybody. And, you know, I would love to have this more as a discussion, because we have a, you know, pretty intimate group. So, you know, if anyone wants to ask questions throughout, I'm, you know, open to just kind of having this as a discussion. And I'm going to briefly just share my screen with you all. And hopefully this, oh, you know what? I cannot share.
Carol Francis has to make you a co-host.
Okay, great. Yeah, in the meantime, I can do what Steve suggested, which is tell you a little bit about myself. So as Steve mentioned, I used to work for the National Lawyers Guild before coming to the ACLU, and I'm actually pretty new to the ACLU. I started here in February. And prior to that, I was working as a civil rights lawyer affiliated with the National Lawyers Guild, which is another civil rights bar association. And prior to becoming a lawyer, I was an organizer, a community organizer for many years. And so I think that perspective really informs my lawyering. The reason I got involved with the National Lawyers Guild was because, you know, in my youth, I had been, you know, arrested for protesting, and the National Lawyers Guild represented me. And so, you know, I wanted to pay it forward to other activists. I believe it was Carol who mentioned being arrested at protests. And so, you know, I've had the opportunity to represent, you know, other activists, give Know Your Rights presentations, and really help on the legal arm of the movement to, you know, to support that work. My passion is representing clients who are unhoused. About 90 to 95% of my clients since becoming a lawyer have been unhoused. I've also, like I said, had the opportunity to represent activists. Like last week, I was in court for an activist named Carlos Nieto, who's an unhoused rights activist, and he was ticketed and detained and taken to the police station for crossing over the border into a unhoused encampment sweep, where he was filming and documenting and protesting. And we went into court and got his case dismissed. And so I love being able to work on those kind of cases as well. And when I became an attorney, I really viewed the role of litigation in the law as being within the framework of the larger activist context. I believe our legal system is very imperfect. It's largely very broken. We have a limited amount of legal tools. And so, you know, recognizing those limits on the front end and realizing that being a lawyer is not enough. We need to be out in the streets too. We need to be, we need to be using all of the tools in the toolbox. So I view being a lawyer as just one of those tools. It's not, it's not the primary tool. And increasingly the ACLU has that philosophy as well. Okay, should I share my screen? Let's see if this works. Yay, okay. Okay, is everyone able to see my screen? Okay, great.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. All of which is to say, so throughout law school, I worked as an organizer and became a lawyer about 5 years ago. And when I passed the bar exam, I did not take a job with a law firm or something like that. I called up a solo practice civil rights attorney who was working on unhoused rights. He was down in San Diego. For those of you who know Carol Sobel, the civil rights lawyer in LA, I called Scott Dreyer, who's kind of like the Carol Sobel of San Diego. And I said to him, I want to do what you do. How do I do this? And so he was swearing about, all the injustices. And he said, come to my office tomorrow and, you can start working for free. So I went to his office and he let me, join him and learn from him. And together we challenged a city practice in San Diego, which was the so-called encroachment code, which made it a crime for anyone who's unhoused to basically put down property, anything you own, whether it's your sleeping bag, your tent, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a coffee cup. Anytime you put something down on the sidewalk, that was included in the scope of the law. And so we challenged that on many grounds. We challenged it on due process vagueness. We challenged it on, equal protection because it was only being enforced against unhoused folks. But the crux of the case, and I'll get into this a little bit later, was Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment, saying that people could not be punished simply because they were unhoused. That case ultimately settled. It was Arundel versus the city of San Diego, and we settled that one and got some policy changes to the way that San Diego enforces laws around houselessness. And unfortunately, any lawsuit is not going to it's not going to fundamentally change the problem of criminalization, right? One piece of litigation, what we find is that cities, once you sue them and once they have to stop doing something, it's kind of like whack-a-mole where they find a new way to criminalize. And so we
can we ask everybody else to go on mute, please?
Okay. So yeah, one of the challenges in doing this work is just that cities and the government are very clever at finding ways around evading civil rights lawsuits, right? And so if you sue them on one thing and then they change their policies, they can always change them and find ways around the law. So in any event, we made some progress there, but there's so much work to do in San Diego and LA and every city around the country. So that's a little bit about my background. Steve mentioned just kind of the background of the ACLU. I know many of you have been involved with the ACLU. It's the nation's largest civil rights law firm. It's been around for over 100 years. And a lot of times we think about the ACLU as defending what are called negative rights. Those are the thou shalt not rights. The government shall not interfere with your right to free speech and freedom of religion and bodily autonomy, right? In the case of abortion rights. So we think about the ACLU as standing up for negative rights, but increasingly there have been changes, as Steve alluded to, in recent years where the ACLU has become more and more focused on equal protection and realizing that our structures and our systems have embedded history and legacy of racism, for example, and we need to focus and have an equal protection lens and an anti-racism lens to everything that we do. The other recent change, which I think all of these kind of forward movements within the organization are a good thing, is looking at what's called an integrated advocacy model, which recognizes the limits of litigation, that we can achieve certain things through litigation, but that's only if we have a statute or a constitutional right on our side. And I heard some of the discussion around juries and some of the recognition of the limits of our legal system. And we can only sue and win when the law is on our side, but often it's not, right? There are systemic injustices and systemic wrongs that cannot be redressed if we don't change the laws. And so the integrated advocacy model recognizes that we need to push for change to our laws. It increases our focus on, legislative lobbying, and also working with community groups. I think the ACLU has changed in recent years to really work more with community-based grassroots organizations, and realizing that change comes from, protest in the streets. It's not going to come, just from civil rights lawyers. Civil rights lawyers are one piece of that larger whole. So in terms of the team that I'm on, like I said, we work on economic justice, and like Steve said, we work on, we recognize that how is somebody supposed to enjoy their right to freedom of speech or freedom of religion or any of these rights if there's no roof over their head, if there's nothing, if they don't have access to medicine. So negative rights really depend on those positive rights, and those positive rights create a duty on the government. And ideally, that duty creates an opportunity for us to litigate if the government doesn't provide those things, those positive rights. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need a legal right to housing. I mentioned that the two North Star principles for my work are fighting back against the criminalization of poverty, as well as advancing a legal right to housing. I'll focus mostly today on just a few solutions. I'm going to talk about 3 solutions that the ACLU is pushing for right now in terms of policy change. And I think we can just kind of open it up to question and answer after that. So before we get started, does anybody have any questions or thoughts? I know that some of you are already working on housing rights issues. I think I heard somebody is also involved in the Pasadena rent control measure. And I think that's what I heard.
Yes, we've been very involved with that, and we have it now on the ballot.
Yay!
That was a culmination of 22 years of work. My wife started on this campaign in 2000, and along with a few others, and finally, after this past campaign took 3 years, it's now on the ballot. Got 15,000 ballot signatures, about 500 or 1,000 more than we needed during COVID. It's amazing.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And that's very similar to one of the solutions I'm going to talk about, which is another ballot measure in LA. So I think that was Anthony talking, but I can't see everyone. But if you want to bring that up when we're talking about solutions, I would definitely welcome that. So just a little bit of a history in terms of how we got here. Historically, there was a lot more federal investment in public housing. Not to say it was perfect. I grew up, I grew up in Chicago next to Cabrini Green, which was one of the largest kind of infamous housing projects in the city of Chicago, which was very segregated from the rest of the city. But houselessness was significantly rarer prior to the 1970s, just because government investment was more substantial in public housing. In the 80s, that started to shift as taxation on the highest income earners went down, and also federal investment in public housing. Public housing just became less cool. It was, the public policy shifted at this time. And so what we see is that increasingly a focus on vouchers, where we have a really long waiting list for, Section 8 vouchers. Many of my clients wait on lists for years for these vouchers. These are like the golden goose, and you can't access them. And when you do, it's very hard to use these private vouchers. By the 90s, there were 5 million more people who needed affordable housing than units available. And now only 1 in 5 households that are eligible for affordable housing receive it. So I'm sure all of you know the answer to this question, but I'm going to pose this to the group. What is the #1 cause of houselessness today?
Medical bills?
I think that's part of it, but I would say it's a larger, what would be kind of the larger systemic way to frame that.
Lack of affordable housing.
Yeah, we just can't afford in the commodified housing market. People cannot afford housing. When housing is a commodity and not a right, there will always be people who cannot afford it. So it's really the cost of housing is not keeping pace with incomes. You know, incomes are not rising at the same level that housing prices are, and we don't have public housing and significant investments from our government in that system. So I would say that in the media, one of the things that I find frustrating is the focus on individuals with regard to stories on houselessness, right? We always hear, even if there's, you know, some kind of a crime or something, we'll hear about, you know, an unhoused individual committed this crime or something like that, or a story about how someone became unhoused, which is all important, but really we should have more focus on the systems and structures that are creating this, because it's not about individual failing or individual luck. It really is about why people are in a systemic way falling through into houselessness every day. So just to ground us in the current reality, more than 160,000 people are unhoused in the state, more than 66,000 people in LA County. Obviously, California is a land of a lot of wealth, and despite that, we still have one of the largest unhoused populations in the country. Our subsidized affordable housing doesn't come close to meeting our demand. Like I said, people are waiting for these vouchers and unable to use them. And the housing crisis affects every single community throughout our state, but it doesn't affect us all equally. So it's important to recognize that historically marginalized people are overrepresented in the unhoused population. For example, 1 in 3 unhoused individuals are Black. It's Pride Month right now, and more than 1/3 of all unhoused youth are LGBTQ people. And this is because of the legacy of redlining and historic racism in our housing policy, that intergenerational wealth for Black families is not available. So eviction rates are significantly higher for Black renters. New home ownership and also home transfer, you know, from generation to generation is at historic lows for Black families. So that's where we are, and I'm sure all of you have, you know, seen the crisis, interacted with the crisis, helped individuals, and I know many of you are intimately involved in this issue. Unfortunately, government responses have too often focused on police response, and at the ACLU, that's one of the things we work to fight is the criminalization of houselessness. Instead of massive investments in affordable housing, which we believe is the solution to houselessness, the state has, in every state, you know, around the country, in every city, there's massive discrimination in the form of criminalization of unhoused people. I highlight the word discrimination here because the ACLU in recent years has started framing this as discrimination. You know, we've long called it criminalization, which is what it is, but we are now looking at this as, you know, systemic discrimination against people who are unhoused because they're in the category of being unhoused, and that's what discrimination is. So we've shifted our framing of this issue to a more discrimination-based framework. One of the challenges in addressing criminalization of houselessness is that housing is not a protected class under the law. And we'll get into that a little bit later, that equal protection under the law receives heightened scrutiny by the court if you're in a protected class, which housing status is not. And so we would like to change that to help to combat this type of discrimination. But the discrimination I'm talking about is the fact that when you're unhoused, everything you do becomes a crime. I've had clients who've had, you know, upwards of 40 citations because you just can't avoid them when you are unhoused. You know, sitting down, lying down, sleeping, you know, trying to shelter yourself in a tent. having a shopping cart to move your belongings, going to the bathroom. We don't have public restrooms for people, and yet it's a crime to, go to the bathroom outside. So literally your whole existence, you really can't avoid violating the law because our legal system has made it a crime to be unhoused. Like I said, cities all over the country criminalize houselessness. 72% of cities have at least one law restricting camping. 55% of cities have one or more laws prohibiting sitting or lying down in public. And 50% of cities have one or more laws restricting living in your car. So in LA County, it's around a fourth of people who are live in their cars. And that's actually one of the best ways to, if you're unsheltered and unhoused, that's one of the best ways to shelter yourself. And that is a crime in many cities. And so part of the work that the ACLU does is to fight back against these types of laws. I mentioned the lawsuit in San Diego that I was part of, where we fought back against a law that made it a crime to basically put your belongings on public property. But some of the historic wins, I'm not sure if probably folks are familiar with Jones v. City of Los Angeles, maybe by show of hands, if anyone's familiar with that case. Okay, that was in the early 2000s, and that was a case that established that under the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment clause, it was unconstitutional to criminalize someone just because they're homeless. This lawsuit had to do with a municipal code called 4118D, which in LA still exists, but it's been modified. And it makes it a crime to sit down or lie down in the city of Los Angeles. And prior to the Jones lawsuit, it applied anywhere, no matter what, it made it a crime to sit or lie down for any length of time. And so, as you can imagine, if you're unhoused, you cannot avoid sitting or lying down. And the court in this case actually said, we cannot exist in a state of perpetual motion. People have to sit down or lie down at some point, and you can't make it a crime to exist. As long as there are more unhoused people than there are shelter beds, it is unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment to enforce the sitting down or lying down law, because it effectively makes it a crime. The status of being unhoused is effectively made a crime by this law. So that was the Jones v. City of Los Angeles case. That was in, I believe, 2005. It was the early 2000s. It was vacated due to settlement, but the Ninth Circuit precedent still stands. It's taught in law schools. Carol Sobel was the lead attorney on that case. And fast forward to the present day, we have a couple of years ago, we had another lawsuit, Martin v. the City of Boise, which was a very similar lawsuit on an anti-camping law in the City of Boise. And that was also in the Ninth Circuit. And it really codified what we already knew to be the case from Jones, but we just have a more recent Ninth Circuit case that we can kind of hang our hats on. So these cases are important, and they're also very limited, because like I said before, when cities are prohibited from criminalizing people, they find creative new ways to do it. And so following Martin v. City of Boise, now what we're seeing is that cities will get creative, and for example, they'll leave 50 shelter beds open in order, and they'll give those to the police department so that they can tell someone, I'm going to give you a ticket unless you go into the shelter bed. So it's kind of a very carceral, punitive way to look at this framework, but it's technically, by the letter of the law, it is kind of a workaround or a loophole that cities can use. So we're seeing more and more kind of loopholes that cities are using. But these are still important tools, legal tools that we have. Other creative tools we have, a lot of unhoused rights lawyers are alleging, in addition to the Eighth Amendment, they're talking about cruel and unusual, state-created danger. Under the due process state-created danger theory, the government can't leave you worse off than you were before they got a hold of you. And so saying that the government, through criminalizing, through sweeping and doing these unhoused encampment sweeps, are making people worse off and actually in danger, because sweeps will take people's belongings, including their medicine, their tent, their paperwork, all of these things that they need. And so some lawyers are starting to allege state-created danger. Also, due process and Fourth Amendment are really prevalent legal theories that are used with unhoused rights lawyers, because people's possessions are being taken in these sweeps, and also they're not often given due process for that. Last year, the ACLU released a report called Outside the Law, which really focused on this. And like I said, we've started framing it since that report. We've started framing this type of criminalization as discrimination. And the reason we feel that it's important to do that is because we would like to shift the law in this regard and create a protected status for housing. So another piece that we push for is progressive taxation, and really we do a lot of budget advocacy and monitoring the budget. I just put a picture in here of the 2022-2023 recommended budget for the county. And as we all believe, I'm sure here, budgets are moral documents, and in order to actually get to real solutions as opposed to just pushing people out of sight, we need to invest in housing for them to have. Every study has shown that housing first is the most effective response to houselessness. It's California's official response by statute. We have a statute that codifies housing first. And what housing first means is that we're not having prerequisites for people. We're not saying, in order to obtain housing, you have to be drug-free or alcohol-free, or you can't have a criminal record. No, housing first says you have to meet people where they are and provide housing first. And then housing really is a form of healthcare. Once people are in housing, then we can deal with all the other issues that may be in someone's life, whether that's mental health care or other types of healthcare. And some studies have, many studies have actually shown that this is a way that governments can save money, is by investing in housing first. Because if we put those dollars to use by actually providing public housing and public vouchers for people to obtain housing, we're going to spend a lot less on police enforcement. The police enforcement that I've been talking about is very expensive. And emergency room visits. Most of my clients, the primary mode of healthcare that they receive is in the emergency room. I had one client who had lung cancer. He always had a cough, he was always coughing. And so it would get so bad to the point where he would go to the emergency room and they would give him some antibiotics. He never caught his lung cancer because it was always to the point of pneumonia, where they would give him, antibiotics, and he ultimately died of lung cancer. But, I just watched as, that there was not the access to medical care that he needed to prevent that. So progressive taxation, I think we've talked about, which is modeled on people's ability to pay. Basically, it's the idea that those with the most have the most responsibility to pay for the people with the least. And that can include, just higher rates of taxation for the highest income earners. And it can also include taxes on luxuries. So for example, one of the solutions I'm going to talk about today is a mansion tax that's on the ballot in the city of LA. And so those would be examples of where funding can come from for affordable housing. We also advocate for less funding. Well, actually, the ACLU of SoCal is an abolitionist organization, so we would advocate for significantly less funding from law enforcement. So as you can see on this chart, law enforcement is one of the highest ticket items in any city or state budget. And so we would advocate for taking money from there, as well as progressive taxation to fund affordable housing and public housing. So now that we've talked a little bit about the problem and the history, these are 3 solutions that the ACLU is working on right now. And I would welcome anyone else to talk about solutions that you're all working on. I'm not mentioning the Pasadena ballot measure here, so I'd love to hear more about that. It's pretty similar to number 3, which is the ballot measure. But 3 things I'm going to talk about are the anti-discrimination law that we're pushing for, the constitutional right to housing that has been introduced this year, and the United to House LA ballot measure, which is currently just qualified and will be on the ballot in November. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is our anti-discrimination campaign. We call it our Equal Rights for Every Neighbor campaign. And the goal here is what I've already talked about, to combat the discrimination against unhoused people in the form of criminalization. Right now, California's Government Code 11135, which prohibits discrimination by government-funded entities, has a lot of protected classes here, right? We see sex, race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, ethnic group identification, age, mental disability, physical disability, mental condition, genetic information, marital status, and sexual orientation. We would like to add to that list just 2 words: housing status. So it's a very short bill that we're pushing for. It would just add 2 words to an existing code. But those 2 words would make a big difference. It would make a big difference for a couple of reasons. One is what I've already talked about, which is changing the narrative around this. You know, we really want to focus on the fact that this is discrimination. And so one of the goals of this is narrative shifting. The other goal is to just give us another legal tool to challenge government criminalization of poverty. If we have this legal tool, then we can, sue government entities that discriminate based on someone's housing status. And actually, I've been talking with Steve about this one because we have some, legal analysis that we're developing. We have not been able to find an author for this bill this year, but we're hoping to find an author next year. And so right now we're kind of in the brainstorming and coalition building phase, where we have ACLU and a number of other organizations working to push this as an idea. And we're talking to state legislators right now about introducing a law next year that would do just this. So any questions about this or anything so far? I just want to open it up in case anyone has any burning thoughts.
Kath,
Yeah.
it's always good to examine an issue by looking at the opposition. So whether it's policy groups, politicians, think tanks, who opposes housing status as the grounds for discrimination?
That's a great question. And I don't think we fully know that yet because we haven't, we've launched the campaign, but we don't have an author yet. So I don't think we fully know. I mean, this would apply to government actors. And so, I mean, honestly, we might have opposition from the cities and the counties because they're the ones who are primarily enforcing laws to criminalize. So we may have, some opposition by, local jurisdictions who want to keep these legal tools to, push people and, effectuate these sweeps and things like that. So, that may be one. I don't think that the apartment association or any of kind of the, I don't know that we'll have corporate opposition to this one, but yeah, I think we'll see, Steve, what that looks like. I'm sure there will be opposition and it's going to be an uphill battle, but I think we can win it. It might be a multi-year fight though. We're not predicting that this is going to be an easy one. In fact, our lobbyist has already identified that this is going to be a challenging lift. But yeah,
No, Kath, I think you have a big heart and you're an optimist. I think corporate housing advocates, we just saw a mayoral primary with a real estate developer getting the most votes. So I think they will see treating housing status as a basis for discrimination as a threat to their corporate profits. And that in one way or another, they'll see this as a stepping stone to them being forced to provide affordable housing and all the like. So I may be a pessimist on that, but I think a good campaign on this will be to analyze potential arguments and opposition and then be equipped to respond.
Anthony Manousis. Oh, I'm sorry, Kath. Did you want to respond to Steve and then we'll hear from Anthony?
Sure, just briefly. No, I think you're absolutely right, Steve. I think we need to do that analysis, and maybe you can help us with some of that analysis. And also, I think you're right that the business community will see this as a slippery slope to, amending UNRRA to include this now as a protected status, and laws that will directly impact business. So you're right. I mean, we're not going to stop once we get this one. And it is a slippery slope, so they should be right to be worried. But so we'll at the right now, as we don't know, but I think you're right that we should predict who's going to come out in opposition. Probably
Okay.
Police unions will also probably be opposed.
Yeah.
Yes. Kath, before I call on Anthony, you dropped out a little bit, or your audio got a little distorted and occasionally dropped out for a second. But if there's anything you can do at your end, that would be good. And I saw Anthony raise his hand on screen. Anyone who wants to ask a question at this point, raise your hand. And after Anthony, then I think we will move on and let Kath go to the next stage of her presentation. Anthony?
Well, I just want to say I'm totally on board with what you're saying. I mean, the current laws are ridiculous. A person can get cited for sleeping in their car, but if they get out of the car and sleep on the sidewalk next to it, that's legal in many places. And we're starting a safe parking program, and it's not technically legal even for a person to sleep in their car on a church parking lot in our city. We're going to have an amendment of the conditional use permit for churches, although they're not enforcing the law. I mean, it's just on and on and on. We need to have a law that gives people who are experiencing homelessness the same rights as everyone else. Even a motel can turn someone down for being unhoused. And a third of the arrests in Pasadena are related to homelessness. And another third of the arrests are people who are unemployed. So 2/3 of the arrests in Pasadena are for people who are poor. That's a ridiculous use of our police. So on and on. I mean, what you're doing is critical, and I want to stay in touch with you. We want to support you and the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Anthony.
Ditto, Anthony. And I would love to hear more about Pasadena's response to the church parking lot being used, and if there's anything we can do to support getting that carve out or getting the city to change that law. I would love to work with you on that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Should I keep going or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, please keep going.
Okay. So just to wrap up this, if anyone wants to get involved in this, we would love that. Like I said, we're looking for an author for next year. We have a coalition that's building. If anyone wants to be part of that and also be part of, we have a speakers bureau which is unhoused folks who want to tell their story of discrimination. And so we have a really compelling speakers bureau that just started. So if you ever have opportunities for people to speak and tell their experience with this type of discrimination, that would be great, because people are looking for an opportunity to share their stories. The next solution that I want to talk about that we are really excited about is SCA 9, which is a right to housing. And this would create a legal right to housing in the state of California. We know this one's not going to pass this year. It's not going to pass next year, probably not going to pass the year after that, but it has been introduced by Senator Lina Gonzalez. It's a constitutional amendment. So it would pass through the legislature and then go to voters as well. But this would ensure that there is a legal mechanism for right to housing. And basically what the senator wants to do this year is she wants to create town halls and press events to talk about the right to housing. And right now we've created a sign-on letter for legislators to endorse a right to housing, but really define what it means, because a lot of people are talking about a right to housing. Our president has talked about how we need a right to housing. State legislators all over our state have, declared that we need a right to housing, but we haven't really defined what that means. And so part of the goal of this is to create that legal analysis and framework for what a right to housing will mean. At the bottom here is the text. The fundamental human right to housing is hereby declared in the state. This right ensures access to adequate housing for all Californians. It is a shared obligation of the state and local jurisdictions to respect, protect, and fulfill this right through progressively implemented measures consistent with available resources within an aggressive but reasonable time frame. So for any of the lawyers in this space, you know that what this will create is a private right of action to enforce this right. What a right to housing is not, it doesn't mean that the government has to provide everyone with a free house. It doesn't mean that the government will spend all of its money on housing to fulfill this right. But you see in here, it's progressively implemented measures consistent with available resources, an aggressive but reasonable time frame. So one of the things we're looking at is other countries where a right to housing does exist. France, Scotland, South Africa, among some others. We're also looking at the UN international definitions of a right to housing, and adequate housing, that's a term of art in the UN. And basically there are seven elements of adequacy of housing under the UN definition. Security of tenure, availability of services and infrastructure surrounding that housing, affordability, accessibility, habitability, location, and then also cultural adequacy. So those would be the standards by which SCA 9 would define adequacy of housing. And so this would create an affirmative duty for the state of California. It would be the first state to create this right. And we feel it's important to really create this analysis, the legal analysis, looking at international law, and inform this discussion that the senator is going to have this year. So we're going to be part of some town halls. We're going to be part of press events this summer, defining a right to housing, talking about what it is. And we have some legislators, local and state, who are talking about a right to housing, but they're also talking about an obligation to accept housing. And we are opposed to that piece of it, the obligation to accept whatever's offered. Often when people talk, like Daryl Steinberg, is doing a lot on housing up in Sacramento, but his definition of a right to housing would not be consistent with ours. His right to housing can include, tent encampments and congregate shelters. I've never had a client who's ever wanted to go into a congregate shelter. I've had, clients who are seniors who are forced to go onto bunk beds and congregate shelter situations. I have a current client who's in a congregate shelter right now who's telling me about like feces on the walls. Nobody wants to be in a congregate shelter. So when we talk about a right to housing, we mean a right to permanent, adequate housing. We're not talking about just anything that the government offers. And furthermore, we're talking about voluntary housing. We're not talking about forcing people to accept something or using housing as an excuse to further criminalize people. So that's another reason why we feel it's important to get behind this campaign, is to really define what a right to housing is and what it isn't. And a right to housing can be implemented through a lot of different measures. So, you see this progressively language, but it can be a number of strategies. So just government regulation of the market. Right now we have essentially a free housing market. And so some, regulations, whether that's rent control or other types of regulations, government subsidies, rent control, progressive tax policies that I mentioned. It can be government building housing. It can be government vouchers for housing, rethinking our zoning policies. It can be creating a right to housing, a right to counsel in eviction proceedings. Many of us are talking now about the inequity baked into the eviction model where most landlords are represented and historically most tenants are unrepresented. And that creates, a fundamental problem with their due process, and tenants who have lawyers in eviction proceedings do significantly better. Most people have, a soft landing, as it were, as opposed to getting, kicked out of their home. So there's a number of policies that could be encompassed in a right to housing. It's not a one size fits all. The government can use a lot of different strategies to effectuate a right to housing. So Steve, I see your hand up here.
Yes, two quick things. One, frankly, I'm surprised not to see the word voluntary in the quoted language at the bottom of this slide. I read it a couple times, and I don't know if this is going to go through any drafting, but to that point, the ACLU in New York took some flack when it opposed forced housing policies for unhoused people. And at first, progressives and liberals didn't understand why would the ACLU oppose forcing people into housing. And I think that's your point about it being a voluntary act based on the autonomy and privacy rights of individuals. Could you expand a little bit on what's behind the ACLU's approach to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think so Steve, to your first question about whether voluntary language should be included in here, I think we should have that discussion. We are actually, the senator has said that she'll add the word permanent per our recommendation to this language. So that's one amendment that we have kind of pending, because we wanted to make clear that this does not apply to congregate shelter, and it also doesn't apply to tent encampments or anything else. In terms of voluntariness, I think we should talk offline about whether that's needed. I think this creates a duty on the government, and there's nothing, there's nothing about a duty for individuals here. So I don't know if we need it, but we should discuss it, because if there's any confusion or lack of clarity, we know how that will turn out. So we should talk about whether that's a proposed amendment that folks think is important. In terms of why we think about the voluntariness piece, we see, I think I've covered this a little bit, but, right now, shelter is being used as a tool by law enforcement. When law enforcement goes out to conduct a sweep or to enforce criminal laws, there's often kind of what I would consider a fake offer of shelter, because we don't actually have enough shelter for everyone. But the police will say, oh, they don't want services. They're service resistant is a term we hear a lot, which is not true. Every client I've ever had, wants housing, needs housing, would accept adequate housing. What's being offered is not adequate. We don't even have enough shelter beds for everyone in the first place. But like I said, some law enforcement agencies they have assigned shelter beds. Like in Long Beach, there's 5 shelter beds that are assigned. In San Diego, it's about 50, where law enforcement can actually dictate who goes into those shelter beds. And they do so in a way that makes it essentially involuntary for people. You either get a citation or you go into shelter right now. And so we're opposed to that. It creates a false narrative that people are service resistant. People are not service resistant. People desperately want and need voluntary health care. They desperately want and need voluntary housing that is adequate. I've never seen somebody turn down, even a hotel room. That's a private space. I haven't seen people turn that down. But congregate shelters, I've seen clients who get beat up there, who have just really undignified, horrible experiences there. They can't bring their dog, they can't bring their property, they can't go with their spouse, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's kind of why we focus on the voluntariness of shelter, because we see that more and more jurisdictions are creating a carceral environment, and not only carceral on your way in the door to shelter, but carceral in the sense that you lose a lot of your freedom when you go in there. You may have a 7 o'clock curfew. You might not be able to have guests there. You might not be able to have your property there. You may have random searches, of your room. I had a client who a staff member just busted right in when she was in the shower. So you lose a lot of your rights in these shelter spaces as well. And so it's our position that you shouldn't have to lose your civil rights to access housing.
Anthony, you have your hand up.
Yes, Kath, I just think I heard you say something about a free market when it comes to housing, and that's certainly not really true. We have a highly regulated market, and that's the problem. In our city, 75% of residential property is single family. It's illegal to have multifamily. Every affordable housing project has to go through often a discretionary process. It's really hard to get past NIMBYism. It's really hard to get housing built in many cities because of the opposition from the status quo residents. And affordable housing is especially difficult to get built. So the crisis we're having in homelessness is related to policies that have restricted the building of housing. So we have to, have a right not just to housing, but a right to build. I mean, we're working now on a campaign just to let churches be able to have affordable housing built on their property, because many of them are not zoned for it. They can't do it. We have a huge problem. Even when they, they want to bless or benefit the community with affordable housing, we've had to go through a 2-year campaign just to get the city council to consider this very modest rezoning adjustment in our city. So that's a problem. We don't have a free market. We have a highly regulated market that benefits the homeowners and the wealthy, and perpetuates the housing crisis we have in our state, and actually leads to homelessness. You all know all that, but never use the word free market for housing, because we don't have one. We have a highly regulated one that benefits the privileged over the people who are. And I like the fact you're not using unhoused, because in our city, the police refer to the unhoused as transient. Yet our homeless count says that over half of the unhoused people in our city have lived here 20 years or more. So they aren't homeless. They have a home. It's called Pasadena.
Right.
And yet they're treated like they don't belong here. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts about what you're saying. And I really appreciate this bill. And I definitely want to have our people know more about it here in Pasadena so we can support it.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, Anthony. I'll change my verbiage related to the market. Yeah, in terms of zoning and land use policies, and also the housing elements. No, you're right. I mean, zoning and everything, it's highly regulated. What I meant by free market, which I'll change my terminology, is just unless there's rent control, there's no cap on how much landlords can charge. That's what I meant.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
So next, I see Doc Ruby with a hand raised.
Yes, I really appreciate all that you're saying and all that you're doing and everything that everyone else is saying. But one of the things that I'm finding is the children and what they're trained into, and the difference between the importance of money and land. Because so many times they're thinking it's the money. And I'm talking about mistakes that my family has made, where we've had over 25 homes. And when maybe they've passed on or something and gone down, the child has been saying, oh yeah, well, I can get the money's good. They're not taught about how important the land is. And then some of the other people, when they do this and they pass out and they spend the money, they're on the streets. So there needs to be more education and re-education, because, excuse me, so many people that are making the funds and everything, and or the land and everything, and they say, oh, they're rich, they got a lot of things. They're taught this. So when grandmother or great grandfather or somebody's gone on, they've taught the child about how important the land is and not just the money. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up too.
Thank you, Doc Ruby. Michael Novick next.
Yeah. Excuse me. Little horse. I think Anthony hit on something we talked about homeowners because, and it's related to what Ruby just said. I think that, we talk a lot about developers, but I think the whole economic system of housing encourages that whole sense of private wealth equity building by owning a home and based on, this whole, the whole inflation in housing that is then reflected in rents. A lot of people see that as a benefit to themselves and they're invested in it. And I think that, trying to find some way out of that is critical. Years ago, I was part of a project that was trying to deal with, building some kind of alliance between, particularly when people started going underwater in their houses after 2008, trying to build some kind of alliance between people who owned homes, people who were renters, people who were in public housing, people who were homeless, all of whom were dealing with different aspects of the same fundamental problem, but really seeing each other as almost enemies in the situation. And I still think that that's the critical aspect that has to be tapped, because in terms of what Steve's early question about opposition, I think a lot of opposition to this actually comes from people who are in housing and own their homes and think that that's, a source of, which it is, generational wealth, as Ruben was talking about. So, to me, that's the conundrum that's got to be solved. And I don't think it's just a matter of declaring a right to housing. I think it's somehow transforming the whole commodification of housing in a fundamental way. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think that's the picture we have to somehow grapple with.
Kath?
Yeah, I totally agree. No, I'm not, trying to propose that these are magic bullets that are going to fix everything. No, these are 3 policy solutions we're working on, but I completely agree that we need to decommodify the housing market. I mean, nothing, yeah, I completely agree. The problem is large and it's systemic and it's based on our economic system. And I love what Doc Ruby said too about, this homeownership is a large source of intergenerational wealth. And that's one of the really tragic reasons why we've seen the inequities that we've seen in terms of, Black families with high rates of evictions and also representation of, 1 in 3 people who are unhoused being Black, is that the intergenerational wealth has not been transferred in the form of property, in real property, in terms of home ownership. And so that's, I agree with everything that's been said for sure.
Okay, we have 2 more hands raised, but I'd like to ask you, Kath, if you have more material to
just
present.
one, yes.
Okay, yeah. And then I want you to be able to finish and then open up the questions, and 2 of the people first on the list will be Vida and Dick Bunce.
Okay, absolutely. So we've gone over 2 of the policy vehicles that the ACLU is pushing right now, and I just want to go over 1 more, and this one is very local. I don't know how many folks are in the city of LA or live in the city of LA on this list. If you don't, you can't vote on this one, but you can tell your friends and family and you can endorse it. I've personally put a lot of time and energy into this one because I think it's historic for the city of LA. This one is a ballot measure. It just qualified. The coalition gathered nearly 100,000 signatures. We had about 98,000 signatures to get this on the city ballot. We just qualified. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it does, but essentially this one is the one that you're going to hear referred to as the mansion tax. And this will be on our November ballot. So what this is, it's a tiny tax on mansions, which is defined as properties over $5 million or more. So a very small tax on these, what we're calling mega mansions that will generate funding to reduce houselessness and protect low-income seniors. It has two mechanisms. One is to help people stay in their homes. So renter protections and actual, rental assistance for people who need it, as well as assistance for people who are currently unhoused. So this is a tax at this time of the real property transfer. It was written by experts in housing, not politicians. So it's something that, it's very hard to get politicians to pass a measure like this. It would have an oversight mechanism, which would be the strongest in LA history. And this would be the largest investment in affordable housing in the city of LA's history. It would generate over $800 million annually. So some differences it has from past measures like Measure H or HHH are that this is a constant funding stream that will never end unless voters vote to end this, but this would be indefinite. The other difference is that it goes upstream as well, and it works to help keep people in their home with renter protections in not just building housing for currently unhoused folks, but helping people stay housed who might otherwise be evicted. So this measure would take place, immediately. It would build low-income housing for people currently unhoused and provide emergency assistance for people who are currently housed but could face eviction. So it's what we refer to as an equitable funding mechanism, which means that only people who are wealthy enough to be selling a $5 million or more property would be paying this tax. So it would affect actually very few of the real property transfers in the city of LA. It would only affect 3% of the real property transfers. So it would really be a very small group of people paying this tax. It would generate $875 million a year in the city of LA. So it would affect the most vulnerable Angelenos and be paid by basically the top 3%. So what does this measure fund? It provides assistance for people currently experiencing houselessness, people at risk of houselessness in the form of rental assistance, actual income assistance in the form of dollars for low-income seniors, and access to permanent housing. It will build affordable housing, more than 26,000 homes in the first 10 years. It'll also support renters, the most at-risk renters, to stay in their homes. Importantly, it'll create jobs because it's building housing. And so we have a lot of labor support. Actually, most of the labor unions, I think all of the labor unions in LA are supporting it, which creates a really good alliance between housing justice and labor justice, and a strong oversight mechanism as well. It's endorsed right now by 140 plus organizations. Our goal is to get to 300 organizations by the end of this summer. So if your organization or if any organizations want to endorse it, the organization endorsement form is right on the website. I think it's unitedtohousela.org, but I'll put it in the chat after I'm done. And we'd love your endorsement. We're trying to get to as many endorsements as we can. And if you have constituents in the city of LA, any sort of free voter education is really, really valuable because this is going to have opposition. You can imagine it will be vastly outspent. Our opposition is the realtors, the landlord lobby, and they're already starting to organize against this. We believe it's in pretty good shape to win at the polls. If things stay consistent right now, it's polling at about 63%. It only needs a 50% vote to win. This is the timeline. In December last year, it was filed. The ballot title was secured in January. There was signature gathering. I've never gathered signatures for a local measure before, only state. And so there's a very short window. It was, 6 weeks, I think, that we had to gather signatures between February and April. I'm going to plug in my computer real quick. I don't know if you all just saw that, but I have a low battery. Hold on one second. Okay, there we go. And the signatures have been submitted. So right now, the summer before the election is always kind of that awkward time where you are gathering endorsements, doing fundraising. So that's where we are right now. And then closer to the election, in the months before that, we just need to go really hard on voter outreach, get out the vote. And you know, we believe we can win. It's going to be vastly outspent, but we believe we can win it. And so the biggest way you can help if you live in LA is to vote yes in November. Tell all your friends and family. And you know, right now you can endorse. And I'm going to, that's all for this policy. And I will just talk about a few ways folks can get involved if people want to get more involved in any of these three. The anti-discrimination campaign, like I said, we don't have an author yet. We are pretty sure we'll have one for next year. So we'd love for you to get involved in that campaign. We have coalition meetings. Stay tuned for updates on that one. In the meantime, you can oppose, as Anthony has talked about, you can oppose laws in your own jurisdiction that criminalize houselessness. In terms of the right to housing, we're just really trying to shift the narrative on right to housing. So I think one thing you can all do is just start talking about the right to housing, the fact that we need a right to housing, it should be a legal right. You know, start spreading that word to your friends and family. In terms of the United to House LA ballot measure, we'd love your endorsement if you have an organization. If you want to volunteer to get out the vote, that would be wonderful. I'm going to be at a bunch of events gathering support for this if you'd like to join. And if you want to give a presentation to a community group to gather their endorsement, that's always appreciated. And then just vote yes and tell your friends and family to vote yes on this. So that's all I have. So if there's questions or just conversation, and here's my contact information if anyone wants to keep in touch.
Why don't we go to full screen with everybody on the screen, folks?
Yeah. Okay, let me stop the share of my screen here. Okay, is that back? Did I pause the share?
Not quite.
Okay, here we go. Stop share.
There you go.
Yay.
And Dave, you're on mute.
Sorry, people. The first hand that I have is Vita Veach, and then Steve Rohde just added himself to the list.
Okay.
Vita-
Rose before me.
Yes, Rose is before you.
My turn.
Yes, please, Vita.
Thank you so much, Kathy. You've just enlightened me and given me great hope. But I have a question that I keep worrying about, and maybe it's what Steve's talked about, corporate housing, or Michael was talking about. I can see that we have the problem with unhoused people. See that we have a lack of affordable housing. But what I also read is that there's a lack, period, in the whole LA County. There's just not enough housing. So they're talking about people keeping people in their homes. But I live in Culver City, and in this west side, as far as I can see, there are enormous apartment buildings. They're obviously not going to be affordable, but is there truly a lack of housing in this county, or is it just the way the political situation? So, like, I'm seeing all these huge apartment buildings just being finished. They don't look full. They look empty to me. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, Vita, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think we need both. We need, and I would open it up to everybody to brainstorm on this question. I think we need more housing, but like you said, there are actually a lot of vacant properties right now, and there's a lot of ways that we can more efficiently use the existing properties. I was able to work with Moms for Housing, a group that's low income, mothers and housing insecure families occupied vacant land that was owned by Caltrans and just, took it over and said, these literally hundreds of homes are vacant. We had the Moms for Housing here in El Sereno, and so the vacancy, I think one thing we can do about that is a vacancy tax. So there's not going to be one policy that will fix everything, and there's and it's not as simple, like you said, as just building more housing either. So it's a combination of all of these types of regulations and incentives and also just investment, government investment too. So I don't think there's one simple answer to that question, but I think you're right, and also I would heavily support a vacancy tax.
Okay, thank you. Richard Bunce is next on the list of questioners, and Richard arrived after we did our group introduction. So would you care to tell us who you are and where you're coming from?
Okay, I've been working with the homeless as a volunteer for quite some time. Also have served on the Planning Commission for Pomona, which is an interesting combination. And I've really appreciated your talk. I'm involved in a number of organizations out in the Claremont-Pomona area. I wonder if, well, first of all, I missed whether or not, whether the mansion tax is LA City or LA County. Is it just LA City?
LA City, yeah.
Okay, that's what yeah, okay, thank you. I'd like to see that become a county tax measure as well. Maybe we can talk about that at some point. I've become unclear in a while since I was on the Planning Commission. I'm unclear as to the role of Sacramento in pressuring local cities to find the land and to open the way for affordable housing. We're experiencing in Claremont that I go to has some property, extra property. The city has come to the church and said, can you please make that available for affordable housing?
Wow, that's great.
The state is really wanting us to do that. So can you help us understand where is the state with zoning issues and with the access to land kind of issue generally?
So I think I can speak very broadly to that, but I'm not a housing element expert. We are in the process of having the cities report back with their housing element updates to the state, and HCID has guidance about all of the zoning issues and the by right affordable housing and actually shelter is in there too. And so cities have to come back to the state. Otherwise, they can be sued for not having, updated their housing elements. But there are, state mandates for the individual city housing elements. And, but ultimately, there's a lot of local control baked into that in terms of, neighborhoods saying, I don't want affordable housing here, or I don't want it here. So it's messy. I'm not a housing element expert. I've, just followed it from a distance, but yeah, there are state mandates for localities to create affordable housing that is, by mandate. And the cities get to figure out how they do that. And usually they always have input from their neighborhood town councils as well, or their, neighborhood councils. So that input gets fed up to the city, and then the city submits that to the state. So there's interplay between the state mandates and the city's response, and then how the city decides to democratize that decision making. In my experience with the neighborhood groups, it can be really difficult because there's a lot of NIMBYism and there's a lot of opposition to those mandates, and the city, is kind of in a bind because they have these mandates and no community group wants the development in their neighborhood. So it's messy, and I'm not an expert at it, but but yeah, that's a good point in terms of how, how all of that happens and how the state mandates interplay with the city processes.
Thank you.
Next, we have Rose on our list. Rose?
Okay, I'll try to be quick, so I know we're really running out of time, but this is a little complicated too. It's a little out of left field. At No Home Alliance, we got a contract from District 4, and there was a homeless encampment that caused a lot of trouble. And we, the group of us, moved all the people in this encampment into a motel, and we kept them there for 3 months. It's cost an absolute fortune, and there's a lot of stories I could tell about it. But the one I want to talk to you about is that during those 3 months, the police raided the motel a few times and carted some of our people away, and they were incarcerated for a fair amount of time. Now, we're amateurs. I mean, our hearts are in the right place. We have a few employees, but we really are amateurs. And what ended up happening was people, not me personally, but some of the people went to court. They were down in court a lot of time. They were waiting for these people to appear. One of the ladies has a dog collar, so she was wearing it and explaining, who she is and all that, to get them released and explain they were now in this safer housing and they were on their path to housing. And we needed a legal person to help us. And really what I'm asking is because we don't have any, we don't know any, and it may be an offline thing, but if you could just put us in touch with some lawyers who could actually help us in a situation like this. I mean, it was crazy, quite honestly, the hours people were spending in court. And these are people with jobs. We're talking about the Valley. I mean, to give you the idea, the motel was on Sherman Way and Coldwater. So we're talking really District 4. But maybe, as I say, maybe offline, but I'd really like some help on this because it's going to happen again.
Yeah, Rose, I would love to just hear about that process. So you were with a community group that helped to just bridge that gap between helping people move from the encampment into the hotel, and then why were the police raiding the hotel? What was the
outstanding warrants? They'd got a list of who was in the hotel somehow, so they were coming for outstanding warrants.
Okay.
Anyway,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I know time is short and I don't want to hijack the whole kind of meeting, but I just really want to talk to you as well.
Yeah, we should talk offline, Rose. I would love to just kind of think big picture. I mean, obviously everyone who was arrested there would have a right to a public defender. Sometimes it's a matter of advocating with their public defender and, finding out who that is, calling the public defender's office. And then, thinking big picture about some of the civil rights pieces of that, and maybe on the front end, groups can ensure that police are not going to be doing, warrant checks or, parole or probation checks. I mean, yeah, your rights are so severely curtailed when you're on parole or probation that those kind of fourth waivers mean that police can come in and search. And so you really have to disentangle law enforcement from any placement of people into hotels. Otherwise, you're going to see those kind of raids, and it's awful. So we should, let's talk offline about, the civil rights angle where you can maybe send a demand letter on the front end. Ultimately, if someone ends up in court, their lawyer is going to be their public defender because they're entitled to that. But there are civil rights implications that we should talk about offline too.
Okay, I've got your email and I will email you. And I'd like to have the people who are actually involved in it talking to you rather than me, because they were the people in it. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, it's 9:23. I see a message from Steve Rohde. He wants to go last. So I'm going to ask Anthony and Steve together to ask their questions, Kath, and for you to take their two questions and answer them as you see fit. Okay, so Anthony, first question. Anthony.
I'm going to be very brief because I put in the chat some policies that are really important, but I think the legal issue is local control is one of the words that we hear constantly invoked. And I see it as very similar to the civil rights movement, where that term was used to say, we don't want outsiders coming into our city, our state, and telling us that we need to give people of color the same rights as white people. We want local control. And the same kind of language and the same approach is being used locally to thwart affordable housing and housing for people who are unhoused. So
Okay.
it's very similar. Thank you. And we need
Okay.
a state.
Steve?
Yeah.
Steve?
Well, I just want to thank Kath, because
Yes.
this was one of the most clear, well-presented programs. I think everybody this morning learned something and more than something. And Kath, our board of directors is meeting next Friday, right after this regular meeting. And every one of your 3 initiatives will be taken up by our board, in which I anticipate endorsement of each of those. So you have laid the groundwork for that. This is an ongoing process with us in working with you and the coalition. And I'm just very grateful. And if you have a moment for any concluding thoughts.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. I'm just inspired to be here with all of you, and I would love to keep in touch and continue working, together with you all. And I completely agree with Anthony's last point, and I think that's well put. Just in the historical context, Anthony, that this local control is really a red herring. What it really means is a local right to discriminate and a local right to, keep people out of sight or push people away. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a complete red herring. And I think both in the criminalization context and in the zoning context. So yeah, I love all the work that you all are doing. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to continuing to work together to create a more just future and ultimately create a right to housing.
Okay, so we have very little time for affiliate reports, and then we do our final circle. And I would like to ask Rick Banyalis, if would you feel comfortable giving us a send off after our circle?
Yeah, I that'd be fine. Thank you.
I think I firmly believe you have something worth for us all that would be worth hearing. So affiliate reports, does anyone have anything to notify us? I see Carol Francis' hand up.
Yes. Yeah, those of you who have not been, which is most of you, not been to the People's Summit, this is the last day. You are really cheating yourself if you don't come, because it is exhilarating. There is so much information, so much clarity, so much figuring out what's going on in the world, particularly in the Americas, and hearing about success in people's movements and standing up to the US government, just in the fact that when Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela were disinvited to the summit that's supposed to be a gathering of the Americas, AMLO, president of Mexico, said, well, if they're not coming, Mexico is not coming, and a number of Caribbean and other countries followed suit. And there's like really a big hole in the official summit. And that translates into a whole lot of excitement and empowerment, of sense of we're winning. So today's your last chance. We are meeting at, we're meeting at 11 o'clock, 11:30 officially. However, Julian Assange's father and half-brother showed up and said they'd like to speak, but there was no time to add people. So they're going to be speaking at 11 before the official summit starts. So I'm going to be there at 11. We're marching in the evening, in the afternoon at 5 or 5:30. You can find out online. I just, last night, there was a plenary finished off with Medea Benjamin talking about AMLO and quoting him as saying, if there's a summit of the Americas and everybody isn't invited, it's not a summit of the Americas. And just why you should come. The people of the Americas and the world need to have you support them. Second reason, ICUJP as an endorsing organization need to have as many ICUJP people there to say, I'm with the ICUJP. I mention ICUJP whenever somebody stops and says, I like your t-shirt. I end up talking about the movement, about us. And the third reason is for yourself, just so that you can get that information, but also that empowering sensation of being with a movement that's bigger. I mean, there was a workshop on Cuba, just Cuba, and it was packed with people of color and whites, enthusiastic. I have never seen this much, this great of a turnout, supporting Cuba and also Palestine.
Carol Francis.
Yeah,
Carol
come
Francis,
on.
I need to interrupt for one
Okay,
second.
one sec.
Okay, and just last question for those of us who are it's absolutely impossible for us to attend. Can we see video of the events that have already taken place?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe you could put in the chat a link to that, or we could just go to peoplesummitfordemocracy.org and find it there. And
yeah,
I
2022.org.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
People's Summit 2022.
Thank you very much.
I mean, you can
Carol
Google,
Francis.
it will show up.
Okay.
But yes, and I would really suggest, I mean, for those of you who live in the Santa Monica area, West LA, just take the Expo line in. It lets you off right at LATCC. And
Let's move on.
Yeah,
okay.
we need to keep moving.
Okay.
So Doc Ruby, I see your hand raised.
Well, mine was just, I was looking for the information for Kat in the chat and I couldn't find it.
She has a post in there in the chat to everyone. So
Yeah,
it's in there. And if not, I will copy it for you and send it to you directly on email. How about that?
That's good. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, Rick. Now I see Rick's hand raised, but was that the point that you were going to make, or do you have another point that you'd like to make?
Just very briefly, KPFK is in the middle of an emergency fund drive, and they've been a very great partner to ICUJP. If you can take some time and take some cash over there, and there's some wonderful gifts that you can have and give out to friends, and please consider supporting KPFK.
Thank you. Steve Rohde, before we do our final circle.
Yes, next Tuesday, the 14th at noon, Death Penalty Focus is hosting a webinar with George Gascon, another progressive DA, and an expert on progressive DAs and the fight against the death penalty. Chesa Boudin has been recalled in San Francisco by an overwhelming 60-40 vote. There is a huge backlash against progressive prosecutors and the movement for reform. So I hope I'll send and resend the notice. Next Tuesday at noon is this webinar.
Thank you, Steve. And let's form our virtual circle. Let's hold hands virtually. And anyone who wishes to raise up a group or an individual at this time, and then at the at the end of that, we'll hear from Rick Banyales sending us off.